The drug lord threatened his brother and family. He was worried. He wanted to help, but he had quit smuggling long ago for his loving family.
Hey, get the fuck back over there! Sit your...
But this time he decided to this job as a last one, not knowing his own best friend would betray him and put his family at stake on that particular day before things taking a sharp turn.
Understand me!
Welcome back to Paramount Recaps. I don't have many subscribers, but your single comment is a ray of hope to motivate me. It kicks off with a helicopter flying over the ocean, coordinating with officers on boats who are ready to inspect a ship nearing the docks. Andy, one of our key characters, spots the officers and frantically wakes up his friend, Walter, urging him to grab their stash of drugs. In a panic, Andy throws a duffel bag full of drugs overboard just as the police close in. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, Chris Faraday is at a wedding for his friend Danny. We meet Chris's wife, Kate, and another friend, Sebastian. The group reminisces about Chris's past, when he was the best smuggler in New Orleans. During the reception, a man named Church approaches Chris. Curious about his current life, Chris explains that he's left his smuggling days behind and now runs a security alarm business, enjoying a peaceful life. However, it's revealed that Chris's father was also involved in smuggling and is now in prison. Church used to work with Chris's dad and offers Chris a way back into the smuggling world if he ever wants it. Shifting back to Andy and Walter, they're driving through the night to meet their boss, Tim Briggs, to explain the loss of the drug. They know they can't run from the situation, so they face Briggs head-on. After hearing their story, Briggs appears calm, but suddenly rams his car into theirs, showing them just how dangerous he can be. Later, Kate gets a call that Andy is in trouble, prompting Chris, Kate, and Sebastian to rush to the hospital. They find Andy in a hospital bed and Walter in surgery. Chris demands answers, and Andy confesses that he had to dump 10 pounds of cocaine when customs was about to catch them. Andy apologizes to his sister, and Chris decides to handle the situation himself. He asks Sebastian to dig up information on Briggs. On the drive home, Chris reassures Kate that he'll take care of her brother's problem. The next day, Chris is working when he gets a call from Sebastian, who has found some information about Briggs. It turns out that Briggs was released from prison a few months ago and is back to his old ways. Chris wastes no time and heads to one of Briggs's hangouts to confront him. Briggs recognizes Chris and demands $700,000 to cover the lost drugs. Chris tries to negotiate, but Briggs refuses to budge, leading Chris to walk away frustrated. Chris later finds Andy packing his bags, desperate to escape. Chris learns that Briggs paid a visit to Walter the previous night and killed him. Furious, Chris scolds Andy for getting involved in this dangerous life, but Andy insists this was the path he chose. Determined to fix things, Chris grabs his gun and goes to Briggs' house. Briggs isn't welcoming, and when Chris asks for a month to come up with the money, Briggs only gives him 2 weeks, threatening Chris's family if he doesn't pay. A brief scuffle breaks out, with Chris warning Briggs never to mention his wife or kids again. Briggs's daughter witnesses the confrontation, and things eventually calm down. Realizing that smuggling is the only way to make that kind of money quickly, Chris decides to get back into the game. He tells Kate, who is understandably upset, but there are no other options. Chris visits his father, telling him about his decision. Although his father was proud when Chris went legit, he understands the situation and helps Chris by giving him his old position on a cargo ship used for smuggling. Chris shares his plan with Sebastian, but insists on smuggling counterfeit money instead of drugs. Even though drugs would be more profitable, they decide to buy $15 million in fake currency in Panama and smuggle it back to the States. Chris checks the crew manifest for a trustworthy team in Panama City and informs his contact that they're coming for a big job. That night, Chris says goodbye to his family and boards the massive cargo ship. He and Andy stow their bags and meet the crew. The ship's captain, Camp, immediately demotes Chris and orders his men to keep an eye on him, clearly suspicious. Later, Chris sneaks a map from the captain's drawer and starts cutting into a wall with a welder to create a hiding spot for the cash. He shows his crew the hidden compartment, but is interrupted by the ship's second-in-command, who doesn't notice anything unusual and leaves. Chris outlines the plan. They'll retrieve the cash during rush hour and bring it back to the ship. To buy time, Olaf is instructed to sabotage the ship. Meanwhile, Briggs and his thugs are watching Chris's family. They break into the house, trashing it, but leave after a shot is accidentally fired. As the ship approaches the Panama Canal, Chris's sabotage slows it down just in time. The captain orders the anchors to be dropped, and they narrowly avoid crashing into the dock. The captain suspects something is wrong but can't prove it. Meanwhile, Chris retrieves the hidden duffel bags, and the crew, including Andy and Danny, make their way through the city to ensure Chris's family is safe. Chris and his crew show up at a shop where Edwin is chilling in the back. Chris wastes no time asking if Edwin got the van and cash ready, and Edwin assures him it's all set. He shows Chris a bunch of uncut fake American bills. Chris checks it out, but something's off. He tells Andy to hang tight and heads off to grab a chemical from the shop. A drop of it turns the paper blue, and Chris goes off on Edwin, fuming because Edwin didn't use starch-free paper. Chris wanted it done right. Like last time, he tells his guys they need to head to the warehouse where the money was made. But Edwin warns that it's a risky move. With just an hour left to get back, Chris still decides to go, even though the captain is searching the boat for him. Meanwhile, at Briggs' place, there's a knock on the door. It's Sebastian, who waltzes in and warns Briggs to keep his hands off Chris's family. He even throws some shade, saying if Briggs had hired a better smuggler from the start, his package would have arrived safe. This guy's playing both sides. Then, we cut back to Chris and the boys. They're a bit nervous about meeting Gonzalo, but Chris assures them he's got it under control. When they arrive at the factory, Danny and Chris hop out while Andy stays behind, listening to a voicemail from Briggs. Briggs wants Andy to take the real cash and deliver it to a spot in Panama, or else his sister and her kids are done for. Andy checks the bag of real money while inside. Gonzalo warmly greets Chris. Danny goes to fetch the van, but when he gets back, he notices Andy is missing. Gonzalo pitches an idea to Chris about joining in on a heist to take down an armored truck. If Chris helps, he can take the counterfeit money for free. When Danny returns with the van and realizes Andy and the money are gone, things take a turn. Gonzalo and his crew pull guns on Chris, feeling disrespected. Chris, quick on his feet, asks if Gonzalo's offer still stands the counterfeit money in exchange for riding along. Gonzalo takes their wallets and IDs, and meanwhile, back on the ship, Captain Camp calls Olaf, giving him 10 minutes to get the boat ready. Olaf relays the message to Chris, who tells him to stall for time. The plan is for Chris and Danny to block the armored truck with their van. When they spot the truck, they pull in front, but the van gets flipped over. Gonzalo's guys rush the truck, blow it open, and start taking the goods. Gonzalo kills the guards and Tarek, on the side, starts paying off people to buy Chris some time. Gonzalo also takes a painting out of its frame, but soon after, the cops arrive, and chaos erupts. A shootout ensues, and the cops start mowing down Gonzalo's crew. Gonzalo takes out a few cops, but realizes he's outnumbered. With the driver dead, Gonzalo jumps into the truck with Chris and Danny. Gonzalo gets grazed by a bullet, and a wild chase begins, but they manage to escape when a bus blocks the cops. Andy makes it back to the ship, and Tarek asks where the others are. Turns out, Chris and Danny manage to avoid the cops. Chris stashes the painting in the van, but when they go to grab their IDs, Gonzalo insists they take him to a hospital. They put him in the van, but as they speed off, Gonzalo dies. Danny retrieves their wallets, tosses Gonzalo's body out, and they get a call from Captain Camp, who wants Tarek on board. Camp also orders his men to search anyone walking on the ship. Chris and Danny speed towards the dock, where Tarek opens a container for them to drive the van into. But as Tarek tries to close the container, a crane yanks it up, leaving the doors open. Danny rushes to shut the doors as the container is set down, and Tarek helps the duo unload the counterfeit bills. Back on the ship, Customs asks Captain Camp to inspect the late arriving containers. As the crew trolleys away the counterfeit money, Camp checks the containers but finds nothing suspicious. Chris returns to his room and goes off on Andy, demanding to know where the money is. Andy reveals that he used it to buy drugs, which are hidden in the ceiling. Chris starts tossing the drugs at Andy until Andy shows him a voicemail from Briggs, threatening his family. Chris cools down a bit and calls Kate to check if everything's okay. Meanwhile, Sebastian watches the drama unfold. Chris decides to dump the drugs into the sea and calls Sebastian to fill him in. Sebastian, however, gets a visit from Church, who threatens him and gives him a few days to make things right. Church's warning is clear. Afterward, Sebastian heads over to see Briggs and tells him to threaten Kate to stop Chris from dumping the drugs. Briggs, in full psycho mode, smashes through Kate's glass doors, grabs her, and slams her head into a mirror. He warns her to make sure her husband delivers the package. Sebastian shows up, pretending not to know Briggs, but Kate smells alcohol on him and gets furious, especially since he's driving her kids. She orders the kids out of his car and drives off, calling Chris immediately. When she mentions Briggs' warning about not dumping the package, Chris realizes something's wrong, but the call cuts out. Kate's friend urges her to talk to the cops, and Kate heads back to Sebastian's house. When Chris learns that Andy got the drugs from someone named Ruben, whom Chris knows well, things get even more complicated. Kate enters Sebastian's house and finds him asleep. She starts packing her things, but when he wakes up and tries to stop her, she slaps him. He chases her, but she locks herself in a room. She calls Chris, but Sebastian breaks in, causing her to fall and hit her head. Sebastian instantly regrets what he's done. Chris calls back, and Sebastian knows he's in deep trouble. Chris warns Sebastian that if he comes near his family again, again. He's a dead man. Desperate, Sebastian calls Captain Camp and tells him that Chris plans to dump the package. He offers the captain a share of the profits if he ensures the package isn't lost. Camp agrees but warns that if Chris doesn't reveal its location, he'll call in the authorities and get the package seized. Captain Camp then heads to Chris's room to search for the package. When Chris refuses to give it up, Camp threatens to have him locked up when Customs and Border Protection arrives. Meanwhile, Chris sneaks into the captain's quarters to steal some keys. The captain alerts Customs and Border Protection. Escalating the situation, Chris duplicates the captain's keys, while CBP begins moving toward the ship in full force, deploying many officers ready to conduct a thorough search. In a panic, Sebastian grabs plastic to wrap Kate's lifeless body, hiding it as the police board the ship and round up the crew into one area. Customs agents search the ceiling and quickly discover the empty hole in the wall. They also check the van, but only find a tarp. As Chris is taken in for interrogation, Andy leaves the boat, receiving the all clear. However, trouble arises when Briggs spots Andy and chases after him, quickly capturing him. During the interrogation, Customs informs Chris that the man who was supposed to bring the container with the van has been dead for years. Chris pretends not to know anything, and they ultimately have no choice but to let him go. Outside, Chris spots Briggs in a car, holding Andy against his will. In a fit of anger, Chris smashes the window and drags Briggs from the car until a thug fires a shot. After being forced back into the car, Chris gives Briggs directions to the package's location, using the key he made to unlock a house. A silent alarm triggers, alerting the police to head to that address. Inside the house, Chris opens the trunk of a car and reveals his cleaning machine, taking it apart to hand drugs to Briggs. This demonstrates Chris's skills as a smuggler. While they're distracted, Chris seizes the moment to hijack a car and escape. Captain Camp goes downstairs to look for Briggs and his crew. Meanwhile, the police arrive and arrest both Briggs and Captain Camp. Chris returns home, calling for Kate, but finds her missing. Meanwhile, Sebastian has Kate's body in his car and plans to dispose of it. Chris arrives at Sebastian's house, trying to break in when nobody answers. Sebastian sits there, filled with regret over what he has done. Chris discovers the broken lock on the door and heads to Sebastian's worksite, where he plans to hide the body in concrete. When Chris arrives, he confronts Sebastian, demanding to know where Kate is. Chris beats Sebastian until he finally reveals where she is. He then hears a phone ringing beneath the concrete and rushes to find the body. To his surprise, he discovers Kate is not dead, but just unconscious. Tarek and Danny arrive at a specific location, leading to an emotional reunion between Chris and Kate. Tarek and Danny begin to pull out the supernotes, finally understanding why Chris is known as the best smuggler. Meanwhile, Sebastian ends up in jail, ironically with someone from his past. Since the van was ordered by a dead man, Customs puts it up for auction. Andy manages to buy the van, and Tarek takes the crew to the dock, where they sell their findings to Church for a whopping $3 million. Church asks Chris about the stolen painting from Panama, and when Chris denies involvement, Church reveals that the painting is worth $140 million and is still in the van Andy just purchased. The story concludes with Chris and Kate enjoying a beach house together, signaling that they have elevated their lives to a new level.